So let me thank very much the Bretton Woods Committee for this invitation, to share this, excellent panel on the global economy of tomorrow. Little topic. And let me start by introducing our panelists. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of the Republic of Liberia. Andrew Sheng, distinguished fellow of the Asian Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. And Ceyla Pazarbasioglu, vice president of the World Bank for Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institutions. Let me start by a general question and then ask a few individual questions to the three panelists. So the first big question is, what do you perceive as the critical issues going forward? Issues that encompass, I would say, a technological change going on in the world today, a climate change, a major threat for the world, but also the demographic changes, which are different, as I will ask a question to President Sirleaf, for South Africa, or for Sub-Saharan Africa, where the population is increasing very fast, versus the rest of the world, where it's aging very fast now. So the very different trends. And I will probably add to this what you can call the crisis of multilateralism in the context of changes in the world power structures, let's say, that is going on today. So in this context, what do you perceive as the big challenge, the way to go forward in a very constructive way for the global economy? Then let me start by a couple of specific questions to former President Sirleaf. One, actually, which is very dear also to my country, Colombia, which is the peace building, which was a major effort that you did in your country as a foundation for economic development. So how do you perceive this issue in the countries that are still going through conflict or trying to build up post-conflict situations? And a specific issue that relates also to the demographic changes and the big challenges of Sub-Saharan Africa, which relate actually to the growing labor force. According to the African Development Bank, Sub-Saharan Africa has to create 12 million jobs a year to absorb the labor force that is growing, and I would say probably even more if you take into account the high levels of informality that exist in most countries. So in that context, how do you perceive the economic engines of growth that can generate that amount of employment?
Well, let me first say all the challenges of the future are all of those you've mentioned. Technological change is moving at such a fast pace that is bound to leave a lot of countries behind in the cases where the infrastructure deficit. Climate change is creating such catastrophic consequences right now that this stands the potential of undermining much of the development, reversals in much of the progress that's been made by so many countries. But more importantly, perhaps, the demographics. Many of our countries have a youth bulge. These are young people 35 years and under, forming 60% of population in so many countries. Many of them educated, but not unable to secure jobs. These are young people that are getting restless. They are the ones that could challenge the peace and stability of nations, looking for opportunities and thereby trying to find those opportunities wherever they can go. And so the challenges that the World Bank and IMF will face in trying to respond to these are real, and things that will have to be addressed in very quickly if we're not going to see many of these countries that have made so much progress with the support of these institutions face some difficult times. I also believe that the challenge of global dynamics, partnerships, isolationism that we're facing, populism that are reversing, how will this impact the future, and how will the World Bank and IMF respond to these? Multilateralism would then be threatened, and what would be the response to that? And we have to look at where these institutions have taken our countries. When the two institutions were established after World War II, there was a purpose. The purpose was the reconstruction of Europe, to enable Europe once again to become a global power, making contribution to world development, and it succeeded. We haven't had that success except in few places like Korea, in which the size and timing of development has been able to meet the needs and to therefore provide the means for transformation of those economies. So again, in the future, will the bank and fund be able to change its procedures, the method of delivering aid, the uniformity of its policies, the conditionality that accompany those policies? Will we be able to change to make sure that we do deliver the kind of support in the size and scale that is necessary to make countries that have struggled? The debt question has been great. I mean, the experience of Liberia has been good. We've had great partnership with the IMF and World Bank. That has enabled us to address the 4.9 billion external debt. It's enabled us to rebuild infrastructure that had been destroyed over years of conflict. It's been good. But we haven't got that scale of support to enable us to make it. And so our institutions have not been built. And that means the kind of support for institutions that are independent, that are capacitated, that go beyond political influence. And that's building our public service, our civil service, giving them the training and the systems, the technology that enable them to be able to stand and to continue to have continuity even when there's political succession. That's what the future of these institutions are really going to be challenged unless we can see this kind of partnership of equality, more equality, partnership in recognizing the ownership of those that are being provided the support, and putting them really in charge of development, giving them the primary responsibility to be in charge of development, but giving them the size of support, the dynamism of support that they need to really transform. Otherwise, my country, one of fragility, like so many others, will find ourselves in a state of fragility for generations, not able to make the transformation that we know we all want to see.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let me, aside from the general question, ask a couple of additional questions to Professor Sheng. The first one is, I mean, you are from the part of the world that has had the most dynamic developing countries over the past 30 to 40 years. So how do you perceive are the major challenges to avoid a stronger slowdown of your part of the world, aside from the other issues that have been discussed quite extensively in the economic literature today, like the middle income trap, in which I said my part of the region seems to be trapped, actually. And the second question relating actually to China. I mean, China is clearly emerging as or is already a major power. How do you see as as it faces its own challenges of development, how do you see it engaging with the multilateral institutions?
Well, I think, this session is fabulous because it talks about the global economy of tomorrow. And I want to answer the questions that you've posed in a longer historical context. What was the context of Bretton Woods 75 years ago, 76 years ago? The answer is, it was the globalization view of the New Deal. America, under FDR, had a New Deal to deal with climate change, unemployment, trade problems, and recovery. Then he applied this from 1934 to 1944 for a global Marshall Plan, the recovery of the world. This 75 years, Asia has been the major beneficiary of that view, no doubt about it. China has grown to be the second largest economy, 1/5 of mankind. India, in 10 years' time, will be a very major power, right? ASEAN is 600 million people, most of which are growing at more than 5%, holding up the present estimates of 3+% growth for the world. But if Asia goes through the same growth and consumption levels of Western Europe and America, there will be no new resources left in the world. The same issue about resource constraints that we all face. And climate change is the major issue that we face in the next 75 years. So my answer back to you is this. What is the new vision for Bretton Woods? Is there going to be a global Green New Deal? If not, are we going to burn up? Do we have a burning platform? That's the heart of the issue. Now, Governor Marcani had this lovely phrase. He said, we're going through a tragedy of horizons, right? Central banks, politicians have horizons of not more than 5 to 8 years. All the issues that President Sirleaf talks about have horizons of a generation. And half a generation, in fact, even 30 years, if we don't deal with some of the problems of climate change, we're going to all burn up. So we actually suffer from a tragedy, to quote Gillian Tett, who is going to moderate later on, a tragedy of silos. We have so many close-minded silo mentalities. We have a tragedy of paradigms. Our paradigm is the old 75 years. We really need to rethink the new 75 years. How are we going to survive this? Do we have the resources to do this, right? How is it possible that with QE, we increased central bank balance sheets by $14 trillion during the last 10 years, bringing interest rates to near zero, and we still can't finance climate change and all the inequality infrastructure needs that we need? So can Bretton Woods institutions, under the present constraint of capital, which we're really talking about peanuts, I'm sorry to say this, the amount of resources that Bretton Woods can now bring to the issues that we face today are very small relative to the huge needs that President Sirleaf talks about. And that is the real challenge that we face today. How do we think out of our mental blocks, put it this way, or geographical blocks, into a one world that Bretton Woods would contribute to a green world, a better world for all our children? That's the question I want to pose to you, José Antonio.
Good.
I cannot answer it because I'm the moderator. So let me ask also an additional question to our Vice President of the World Bank, which relates actually to the more complex world of the multilateral development banks. You have, of course, the World Bank Group. You have the regional development banks, which have a long history, actually including the European investment banks, which sometimes is not included in the list, but it's actually the largest of all. But you also have the two new development banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. And you have national development banks that are as large or even larger, like the Chinese Development Bank. Actually the Brazilian Development Bank is KfW. All very large development bank institutions. And you have the increasing demands for many parts of cooperation, including, you say, on two different sides, the infrastructure demands from developing countries, but also the social demands, for example, associated to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. How do you see this world of cooperation between this complex set of institutions to reach the development goals of the future?
Okay, so thank you. It's great to be here with this panel talking about an issue dear to my heart. You asked what is the key concern for us at the bank and myself. The key concern is linked to what was just said. How do we find ways to deal with those that are excluded? And those that are excluded can be the poor. Those that are excluded are the female population. Those that are excluded include disabled and so on. So the key question in my mind is we cannot have sustained growth unless we deal with this issue of addressing and including those that are excluded. Otherwise, we will have the backlash, just like we have against globalization, the backlash against trade, the backlash against many of the discussion and the policy uncertainty that results from it. When we look at, we have at the bank we have our twin goals, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are very critical. And when we look at the historical growth, even if we were to double growth going forward, we're not going to be able to reach these goals unless we do what Andrew was asking about, unless we find a way to leverage the public sector or the development bank and other multilateral institutions to bring in the private sector. Because there's a lot of money in the private sector. There are a lot of funds which are sometimes sitting with negative interest rates. And the key question is, how do we actually mobilize, leverage this money for the global good? And in this context, the exponential change in technology is great. It's a great opportunity, but it's also scary because the digital divide is growing.
Yeah.
Some have access to it and some don't. And to me, that's going to be the biggest problem in 10 years' time. How do we harness technology? How do we make technology inclusive so that the public goods are in place, the infrastructure is in place to allow the private sector to make money by going to the remote corners of the world, which they can make money. But right now, everyone is concerned about the latest iPhone or latest iPad. But those in remote corners of the world could really use digital payments, could really use micro-insurance, nano-mortgage, these technological advances that help us reduce costs, bring efficiency, and so on. How do we make sure that the public sector provides the infrastructure, the public goods? And I think that comes to your specific question. What is the role of multilateral institutions and development banks? I think the key is, yes, the resources of these institutions are small compared to the private sector, compared to some of the national development banks and so on. But these institutions have a long institutional memory of what works in different parts of the world and how that can be tailored. So be it technical assistance, as the Secretary mentioned earlier today, be it lending to either countries or fragile and conflict states which do not have access to private sector funds, is for us as development banks, it's going to be critical. Three things will be critical. One, we need to have the accountability and conscience to make sure that debt is good debt. It's transparent and it's used for good purpose, that it brings good returns. So we don't end up with bad debt or ugly debt. So It's on multilateral institutions to really coordinate and make sure that the money is used for good purpose in countries. Second is for the countries themselves. They are bombarded with a lot of money coming from different directions. To have that money go to good use, that public expenditures are spent for good use. And I think the last issue is to lead by example. We have to be, as development banks, we have to be transparent. We have to disclose what we do so that the others also follow suit.
Well, thank you very much. Let me actually, I guess, continue raising questions on other topics we have not talked about. I mean, actually, maybe you want, Professor Sheng has mentioned that this crisis of multilateralism that we're facing today, which is perceived as such, at least in large parts of the developing world. What do you mean? How do you overcome that crisis in order to give the opportunities for global development? As Professor Sheng was saying, how do we construct for the next 75 years?
Yes, but José Antonio, there is no crisis of multilateralism. There is a crisis of unilateralism. There's a shift from a unipolar power to a multiverse world. We really need to understand that the Bretton Woods was the creation of a multilateral infrastructure by a unipower. And that's the very good thing. That was creation of global public goods. Now what we need is a democratic, multiverse multilateralism. It's not a crisis, it's an opportunity. I don't subscribe to the idea that multilateralism is dead. It's not dead. It is more important than ever. Even though I'm critical of the available resources for Bretton Woods, there is no lack of resources in the world. If there was lack of savings, you would not have huge excess capacity with no inflation. Right? So the real issue to me is how do we mobilize it? And unfortunately, exactly as Ceyla says, we have this old mindset of 75 years. We are, as Keynes said, ruled by dead professors, right? The dead professors who were writing in those days, when Keynes was writing, climate change was not within his perspective, with all due respect to Keynes. Okay? Inequality was very much not on his major horizon. His major horizon during Bretton Woods was how to protect the British Empire's domination of the preservation of the empire. Unfortunately, it was handed over to the Americans, right? No, I'm speaking the truth. So now you have a situation whereby the world is much more multilateral. And then how do we, within this multilateralism, mobilize resources in a more democratic way to be more inclusive? Because the old unilateralism was exclusive. I'm sorry to say this, but that's the fact of life. How else can we explain the greater inequality that we have seen? Right? In the last 75 years, we have seen greater inequality than before. How do you explain this? This was all supposed free markets, everything was supposed to be good, and it ended up being very exclusive, not inclusive. So now we need a very different mindset. It's not about crisis of multilateralism, José Antonio. It really is about the crisis of the old world.
Well, that's a good question, but a good way of seeing it. But how do we adapt the multilateral institutions for the new phase, let's say? But there is a perception that, in fact, we are going through a big crisis of the multilateral system. Maybe because of unilateral actions. You may be right. Actually, the next panel on trade will probably explore that particular issue. Anyway, Madam President.
Let's agree that there's no crisis of multilateralism. But multilateralism has to change.
Yeah.
Its structures have to change. Its systems has to change. Its partnership arrangement has to change. So we still have to deal with each multilateral institution in accordance with their own procedures, their own organization, their own methods. And unless they can change to do what you want, to be able to reach the poorest of the poor, which is the agenda of the World Bank. But it's not going to happen unless you change the method in which you do this. Yes, we want to see the private sector develop. We all know that's the main engine of growth in our countries today. But we can't get the World Bank to do partnered with a private company to build a road that will provide the means to have a new factory, a manufacturing company come in. We can't deal with the World Bank to see about our regional institutions to build infrastructure on a regional basis. We have to do it with national negotiations. Those are the things that will have to change. And if we're going to meet the, these challenges of the coming world, of the new world, then how are we going to deliver that scale? Can we see the European Union and the World Bank and the African Development Bank all come together, determining how they can raise the level of resources to a particular country to get them to the place where they can take off and they can sustain themselves on the basis of domestic revenue? It doesn't happen that way. We have to come and negotiate with each institution, meet all their processes that are different, not uniform, and then we find ourselves always, grinding the wheel and not being able to get to that level. So we need to know, how do we meet these changes? Climate change is beginning to, like you say, is beginning to burn us all out.
President Sirleaf,
Yeah.
the old mentality was, when I used to work at the World Bank, let me declare my interest. If you come from emerging market, I come from emerging market. I come from the island of Borneo, as primitive as they came. The idea was that you come to Washington, D.C., and you go to the World Bank or IBRD or ADB, and you say, design an infrastructure project for me. Today, what do? You can't do that anymore. Because they don't design, because they talk about macro with you. What you really now do is you go to a corporation and you say, give me a project, design, build, operate, and transfer. Is that a good solution? It's not. What we need as emerging markets...
But we're designing it ourselves now.
Exactly. That is multilateralism. That is diverse competition of new ideas, bottom up, to change from a unilateral top-down design, right? We can't solve the complex problems of this world with a one-size-fits-all solution. No more. We really need to understand that within the one world, we need to have very diverse competition of ideas and very diverse mobilization of resources. And that's what technology has told us. Look, you can have now internet platforms that can crowdfund any good idea that you have. So it's no longer saying to Bretton Woods institutions, says, you must give me the loan at aid or whatever it is. No longer, right? You can actually get aid direct from the people across the whole world. The question is, how do you design it? How do you design the technological knowledge distribution platforms to crowdfund the needs of the masses to be more inclusive?
But just, 30 years ago, I started at the bank in '87. And it was very different then. You used to go to countries and you used to come up with your own programs and so on. Now, it's all about what you said, institutional strengthening. And I think the role of the multilateral institutions is to help build the capacity so that the countries themselves have the ability to look at the different designs that come in front of them and use the bank and the World Bank and other multilateral institutions to actually discuss and agree on what is best for them. And to me, the biggest role for institutions like us is to support, to build capacity, technical capacity in the countries, because otherwise we're not going to get to inclusive development.
Very good. Let's give the floor to you to see if anyone has questions, please. Microphone over there.
Thank you very much. Many years ago, Hernando de Soto's seminal work, The Mystery of Capital, highlighted the fact that 70% of the world lives on untitled land. Estimate $10 trillion worth of capital locked up, inaccessible. Does blockchain technology offer us the opportunity to unlock that $10 trillion and change the world?
Yeah, please, here in the...
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Frank Vogel. I'm with Transparency International. Is part of the change that you're suggesting trusting the people more, being less elitist, having your institutions be more accountable? None of you have mentioned governance at all. Secretary Mnuchin didn't even mention it. President Sirleaf, you've had experience in dealing with the threats of corruption in government. Perhaps from that experience, you could explain a bit to us how you think the multilateral institutions could assist governments that want to reform and make their own government more transparent and accountable.
Anybody from here, this side? Okay. There are no more questions from the floor, but I will ask another question. I mean, one of the big issues now is the crisis of international migration, blocking the entrance of people from developing countries to developed countries, which, by the way, historically, migration was a major opportunity of development for this country, let's say, the United States, let's say for Canada, for Australia. I mean, all countries that would have not been developed, let's say my region of the world, Argentina, Uruguay, which were major recipients of migrants. Even you can say in the post-war period, and recently, for example, migration of talent has been a major source of technological innovation in this country, among others. Now, so maybe how do we face this issue of international migration? Anyway, anyone wants to answer some of the questions that were raised? Yes, please.
Maybe I can start with, on land, this is a great question because 90% of the poor actually live in rural areas and land is a key constraint. And we have our innovation lab at the bank, which is working on using distributed ledger technology to see if this could allow us to be able to better allocate land, better license land, and so on. So it is promising, but at the end of the day, blockchain DLT is not going to work unless the initial information provided is not correct, right? Why we do have problems with land cadastro at this currently, even without the technology. So I think we need also the reforms, the institutional reforms, to make sure that can go together with the technology to provide the right information. I really appreciate the question on governance and trust, because this is a key issue in the vice presidency that I'm part of. A big part of my group is governance. And this is one of our IDA priorities this year is governance and institutions. And that's what when I think of governance, I think about institutions, strengthening of institutions. Because when you have that, you minimize corruption, you minimize a lot of the issues that we discussed earlier. And there's a lot of work on how do we rebuild trust, which we lost with the global financial crisis. How do we have mechanisms for better domestic resource mobilization so that countries are accountable. So thank you for the question, and for us at the bank, it's a key critical agenda.
Yes, please.
Let me give the experience of Liberia in these two areas. First, land reform. we spent about 2 years trying to come together with a land reform program with the support of the World Bank. And at the end of the day, the main objective was to give ownership of land to the communities, put the communities in charge. But we didn't build capacity in the local government institutions to be able to manage that process to their benefit. So as a result, one had to stop the land reform because putting the land to the community meant giving it to chiefs, which is our historical management system, and the chiefs not having the capacity or the knowledge of how to do it could easily bypass the end objective, which is make sure that the land is negotiated, if necessary, granting benefits to the community themselves. They didn't know how to manage it, and the World Bank was not putting resources in building local capacity to be able to see that that program worked. To come to the question about the corruption in the public service, again, institution is the key. Unless we are going to build a private sector with the institutions that have the means and the capacity to manage the implementation of programs, we will not get the results. When you're dealing with a post-conflict country like my own, where the majority of the public service are people that have come with a culture of disobedience, dishonesty, whatnot, and they don't have the capacity, and we have no means to be able to run the programs you want with a huge public service, carrying a greater resources of domestic revenue. The thing to do, of course, is to have resources to be able to remove all of them, reduce the size of the public service by 50%. Put them all in training program with subsidies because there's no private sector, so they know where they can go for alternative employment. Otherwise, you become a social welfare institution providing salaried people who do not have capacity and who do not know how to work. Well, the World Bank will not provide resources for income to those whom one could remove from the public service because it would be what? Social welfare? What else do we do? And this is why we did not have the institutions to be able to build from the level where people realize, that dishonesty and corruption undermines their own capacity and the capacity of the country to achieve its goals. We didn't have the institutions. And so we end up with carrying the load of government is just one layer of those that have the capacity, who have to do all they can, and then we end up creating a group of technocrats, well paid, with a big difference between them and those who are at the lower levels, who are undercapacitated, underpaid, overworked. Our systems have to change, both internally as well as within the partnership institutions.
Yeah, let me take your question on the migration issue. Why do people want to migrate if they're actually doing pretty well where they are? Answer: climate change, bad governance, failed governance, right? I totally agree with President Sirleaf. Where I come from, the island of Borneo, land was community. Somebody came up with the idea that you should carve this out land for individuals. And the result was you cut down all the trees, you cut down. This is a classic tragedy of the commons. There were no commons. We no longer have commons. And so Bretton Woods institutions really need to rethink whether the old model, the old paradigm, still works for a global world in which we cannot carve out concentrate more and more of the resources for the fewer and fewer. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work, right? And that's why they're migrating. And if they migrate, the political problems cannot be handled in the rich countries, right? It's not just the politics of the movement of population. The incoming countries cannot deal with this migration issue. And that is the biggest challenge of the next 75 years. I put it very bluntly. Now, technology can be a solution, but technology can also be the bane, as we know. So I'm sorry to say that, to answer your question on blockchain, I agree blockchain is a great technology, but who says it's blockchain? Everybody who claims it's blockchain, a lot of them has proven to be crackable. So I think blockchain needs to be more transparent in order to be blockchain.
You know, climate refugees are estimated by 2050, 143 million.
That's right.
Climate refugees, those that are running away from the disasters.
Okay, let me underscore, I guess, the two major issues that I understand were raised in this roundtable. The first one is the need to rethink multilateralism for a truly multilateral world, and not through a unilateral lens, let's say, of major powers. I think that's a very interesting issue, not only for the Bretton Woods. I mean, having worked for 10 years for the United Nations myself, I think it's also for the United Nations, certainly. And the second issue was institution building at the national level as a major challenge, and also as a major responsibility of international cooperation from the multilateral institutions. And as the Madam President underscored, is also going to the local level. And that's very essential for rural communities in particular, where you don't build institutions that go to the local level, including community institutions, not only state institutions. I think we are in deep trouble. And let me perhaps take also a question of inequality as something that is very important, the question of inequality between countries, the fact that sub-Saharan Africa is still far behind in terms of development. It generated major challenges for the world. And also the challenges that, when you mentioned of digital divide, is how technology could also increase certain forces of inequality. So how do we use the new technology in a productive way also to reduce international inequalities? Okay, thank you very much. I'm very glad for this panel, which was excellent. Thank you.